The miracle doctor won't be a kept man. My heart belongs ashore. Chapter 251. Solidarity, friendship, cooperation, and brotherhood. Do you remember what I told you? Kiran looked at the crowd. Kiran's enlightening words echoed throughout the place. Gavin and the others were silent. They had forgotten his words. When forming teams, you selfishly refuse to accept your injured comrades. During the training, there was no cooperation between any of you. What makes you think you're so great? Kiran stared at Gavin and the others. They remained silent even though they were upset. Kiran looked at everyone. When I told you my 4 requests, I meant them. These are the values the York family must hold on to from now on. If you can do it, you are welcome to stay and be a member of the family. If you can't, I'll pay you to leave. I will not allow my men to have no sense of justice. Thank you, Mr. Kiran! Jacob's team shouted in unison with excited looks on their faces. Thank you, Mr. Kiran. Many of the eliminated people were moved by his words, too. Gavin and the others were not going to give in. They looked at Kiran and said, If that's the case, we cannot work together. Go ahead, Kiran said. Gavin and the others looked at Onyx and said, Mr. Onyx, doesn't the Onyx clan exist anymore? Onyx nodded and said solemnly, It's gone. There's only the York family now. Humph. The York family? The York family can't even protect Neptune's Cove karaoke, Gavin sneered. He looked at his comrades and said, Neptune's Cove karaoke is gone. So what if Mr. Kiran is powerful? What can he do? He's still a loner anyway. Shut up, Onyx roared. I'm telling the truth. We wanted to help you, but since you don't welcome us, we'll just leave. Gavin looked at Kiran. Kiran calmly nodded. Gavin thought Kiran would give in, but he was furious that he did not budge. He looked at the other men and said, It's dangerous staying with the York family in Bayville. Why should we risk our lives for them? Those who don't wish to die can follow me. He led them toward the exit, and they left, sulking. Onyx was so angry that he could kill Gavin. On the contrary, Kiran remained calm and unaffected. The remaining men exchanged glances. Some stood up and followed Gavin out. In the end, less than half was left. Onyx felt upset and guilty. Kiran was pleased to find out that many people's values were not aligned with his. He would rather they leave. Mr. Kiran is a genius, Frank praised. Everyone looked at him. Frank could not hide his excitement. He said, Mr. Kiran refined the strength pill, and he could make a new batch as long as he has the right herbs. It's not hard to get it all. Suddenly, it all made sense to Jacob and the others. Onyx was surprised too. Did that mean that all he had to do was cook it up? The purpose of Kiran's plan was to get rid of those who had different values. Kiran looked at the remaining people and said, Each of you will get these pills to boost your strength, but the first batch will be given to Jacob and the others. Jacob and the others were immediately over the moon. Thank you, Mr. Kiran, Kiran said calmly to everyone. There's still a lot of training ahead of you. As my men, you must train hard. I hope to see more sweat on the training grounds than blood on the battlefield. I would rather die in front of you than see you die in front of me. Kiran's voice was loud. Jacob and the others were filled with determination. They shouted in unison, We will risk our lives for Mr. Kiran and the York family. We will risk our lives for Mr. Kiran and the York family. Their shouts echoed for a while. Snow, who just arrived at the door, heard the shouts. There was a sweet feeling in her heart. In her eyes, Kiran was a perfect Prince Charming. Kiran distributed the strength pills to Jacob and the others before devising a new training routine. Everyone understood that Kiran was not keeping the pills from them on purpose. It was a step-by-step process. They had to go through the tougher and more in-depth training to build their foundation before they could take those pills. That alone was a great motivator for them. Although fewer people were left, they were more powerful and loyal to Kiran and the York family. Kiran finally had an army in Bayville. Kiran suddenly felt confident about the 7 duels at Neptune's Cove karaoke next week. After Kiran gave Frank acupuncture treatment, Frank went off to Peace Pharmaceuticals to work with Yvonne on developing a product to take on blooming cream. Meanwhile, Kiran returned to Snow's office. For the first time, Snow smiled at Kiran when she saw him. She stood up and praised him. You're so good at winning people's hearts. Kiran was stunned as he had not expected her to praise him. This was the first time. However, winning people's hearts did not quite sound right. It was obviously his remarkable and irresistible charm. He looked at Snow and teased, "How can I win your heart then?" Snow was admiring him at first, but after his teasing, she became shy. She said, "You can never win my heart." Kiran raised his eyebrows and said, "Since I can't win your heart, I won't try." Snow looked angry now. What a jerk! She had already given him her heart. What else did he want? How was he so unromantic? Humph! Fine then! Good thing you're smart enough not to waste your efforts. I can just eat you up, Kiran said with a suggestive look. Snow was furious. Fuck you, crazy son of a bitch! I guess I'll become a crazy wolf now. Kiran walked toward her with a smirk, looking like he was about to eat her. Was he being serious? She noticed the harp next to her and said, "But you promised the woman not to sleep with me. Who cares about her? I want to eat my wife up right now." Kiran pretended to glance at her lustfully. "Pervert!" Snow shouted. When Kiran saw Snow's adorable face, he wanted to tease her even more. He continued his act and ran to her. Snow felt like an innocent little lamb being hunted down by a big bad wolf. Right now, it seemed like she had become Kiran's prey. Suddenly, the harp in the room made a sound. Chapter 252. "Ah!" Snow exclaimed and looked at the harp. Kiran also stopped and stared at it curiously. What's going on?" Snow stared at the harp in surprise. Kiran did not understand how the harp played by itself. When he walked over to check, nothing was wrong with it. It was just a harp. It was made of quality material, and nothing was wrong with it. He plucked it a couple of times, and it was fine, just like yesterday. They never imagined that it would play by itself. Snow did not care about anything else. She was glad it stopped Kiran from doing what he was about to do. She said to him shyly, "Did that woman install surveillance cameras here?" Kiran sneered. "So what? I wouldn't mind if she was here watching us either." Snow glared at him. "I'm not as dirty-minded as you." Kiran shrugged. "Fine, I'll stop being dirty-minded." Then he turned and left. "Hey, where are you going?" Snow quickly asked, looking at his back. "To find out the reason behind my dirty mind." Snow let out a long sigh and said, "Be careful. After I find out, I'll come back and do dirty things to you." Kiran laughed. Snow was speechless. "Go to hell!" She stamped her feet and yelled. Kiran laughed out loud. He liked flirting with his wife to relieve his stress even more these days. He also wished that Snow would be relieved of the trauma of losing her parents. Besides, their duel with Regulus was tomorrow, and he was unsure if that duel would bring back Snow's parents. Kiran went out and drove to the Quinn's residence. At the Quinn's residence, Henry was feeling restless. He just received a message from Alfred saying that people from Wolfgate were coming today, and the 3 major families were going to hold a banquet to welcome them. So everyone had to be present. Since the last incident, the 3 families no longer worked together. They were like enemies now. He wondered what would happen when they met that evening. He also wondered if Alfred would rat them out on purpose since he was closer to the people at Wolfgate. When Kiran arrived, he walked straight in as if it were his own house. Henry was nervous to see him show up all of a sudden. Worried that Kiran would hurt him, he stammered loudly, "Mr. Kiran, don't be afraid. I just came to ask some questions today," Kiran said calmly. Henry immediately smiled. "Mr. Kiran, please feel free to ask anything." "Did you hire the person who took Neptune's Cove karaoke away from us?" Kiran asked. Henry quickly shook his head. "Mr. Kiran, I really don't know. The Quinn family did not pay a single penny when we hired them." "You didn't pay them? Then they could be from Imperial Dragon." Kiran was shocked, but a smile appeared on his face. Henry was surprised, but he nodded and said, "That's very likely." "What a bunch of hooligans!" Kiran scoffed. Henry looked at him without speaking. Kiran stopped smiling. "What else do you know about the Zara woman you mentioned last time?" Henry thought about it for a moment before saying, "Oh, I remember now." "What is it?" Kiran asked. "On the night your family was wiped out, the song that played at Neptune's Cove karaoke yesterday sounded throughout Bayville. I remember your father bursting into tears when he heard that song. He accepted his death then and there," said Henry. Kiran's expression sank. He looked sorrowful as he stared at Henry and said, "Are you sure?" Henry nodded and said, "I'm very sure. It's just that the song did not sound as joyful as it was yesterday. Back then, it sounded depressing." Did you hear the song at Neptune's Cove karaoke yesterday? Kiran asked. Someone recorded it for me, Henry said frankly. Kiran's face was cold and his blood boiled. There seemed to be many hidden stories behind the joyful odyssey. Why else would his master tell him to stop whenever he heard the song? No wonder the woman went to him with such confidence. Who did she think she was? Anger surged in him, especially after he imagined his father accepting his fate, awaiting death. Henry thought Kiran's expression changed because he was angry at him, so he quickly asked, "How about I help you verify it tonight?" "How?" Kiran asked. "The people from Wolfgate are coming over to prepare for your duel at Dragon's Mount tomorrow, so Alfred organized a banquet to welcome them. After the banquet, I can invite them to Neptune's Cove karaoke. If a harp plays there, maybe we can get some information out of them," Henry said. "The people from Wolfgate are coming? It's a good thing they get a good last meal before their life ends," Kiran sneered. Kiran sounded like getting revenge was a breeze for him. Henry was filled with regret for what he did in the past, but it was too late. "Mr. Kiran, what do you think of my plan?" Henry was unsure, so he asked Kiran. "Sure, I'll wait for you at Neptune's Cove karaoke. We'll confirm it together then," Kiran agreed. "Thank you, Mr. Kiran." Henry thanked him. Kiran looked at Henry and said, "The banquet you all are holding tonight, it's a trap, right?" Henry's expression changed when he heard that. Finally, he said, "I believe I will be alive at least until your duel tomorrow, so I can invite them to Neptune's Cove karaoke." Kiran gave it some thought. "I hope so. You all are worthless to them now, so they couldn't care less whether you die or not." Henry looked embarrassed but dared not refute him. Kiran was right. Kiran looked at Henry and said, "You better do your job well. You must die because of my grievances against you, but the fate of the Quinn family members depends on you." Henry trembled and nodded quickly. "Don't worry, Mr. Kiran. I'll get it done." Kiran turned around and said, "See you at Neptune's Cove karaoke tonight." "Don't worry, Mr. Kiran," Henry reassured him again. Although Kiran did not learn much about the harp, the news of Wolfgate's arrival was equally important. He was ready to take action. As for the self-playing harp, Kiran had put it on hold. At 7 o'clock that evening, the Ziegler family's villa was brightly lit. Chapter 253. Many fierce-looking men stood outside, surrounding the villa. The men that Kiran killed at the Ziegler residence used to live under the same roof as the Ziegler's bodyguards. The Ziegler's bodyguards were able to stay calm because they were trained for it. Plus, they were capable and well paid. Right now, the Ziegler's bodyguards were breathless with just those men standing there. They simply cowered silently in a corner. In the living room, it was pin-drop silent. A middle-aged man in his 50s, with a tall build and rosy complexion, sat in the main chair. He sat there with an overpowering aura about him, making Henry and Theodore too afraid to speak. Alfred, who had lost both arms and a leg, laid on his bed without moving. The middle-aged man was the leader of Wolfgate, Regulus. Regulus looked at Alfred on the bed and said, "The Ziegler family is doomed, right?" When Alfred heard those words, he cried in sorrow, "Mr. Wolf, you must avenge the Ziegler family." Kiran's first target was the Ziegler family, right? Regulus glanced at Henry and Theodore to verify. Both of them were trembling in fear, especially Theodore, as he was guilty. After all, he was the one who told Kiran about Imperial Dragon and Wolfgate. Henry was afraid of being blamed, so he quickly said, "My grandson Mitchell was killed by Kiran in disguise as well." "Aren't both of you here alive and well?" Regulus said without emotion. Henry immediately shut up and touched the part of his face where the swelling had just subsided. He wished that it was swollen again. Theodore blinked without saying anything. "Mr. Wolf, the Quinn and Marsh family have joined forces with Kiran. He learned about Imperial Dragon and Wolfgate from them. Alfred rat them out." "Nonsense." Henry and Theodore turned pale and protested. Alfred got even angrier. "If not for you—" "Shut up!" Regulus interrupted them fiercely. The three of them shut up immediately. "Fabian is dead and Alfred is crippled. The Ziegler family needs someone to be in charge." Regulus softened his tone. Alfred got the chills. He looked up, wondering what he meant. Regulus looked toward the door and said, "Bring in Warner Ziegler." "Warner?" Alfred stuttered in shock. Henry and Theodore looked toward the door in surprise and anticipation. The door opened, and two men walked in with a man in his 40s. As soon as he entered, he greeted Regulus. "Hello, Mr. Wolf. Regulus nodded. The man walked over to Alfred and plopped onto his knees. He grabbed Alfred's clothes and said, "Father, I will get revenge for you." The man was Warner Ziegler, Alfred's son, and Fabian's father. When Warner called him father, Alfred's heart shattered. His son and daughter-in-law had been taken away by Wolfgate for many years, so he had not heard someone call him that in a long time. In his mind, they were already gone. He did not think that they would be alive. He shed tears of happiness, but he felt bitter that he could not touch his son after losing his arms. It felt like he had just taken the most bitter medicine in the world. Warner burst into tears. "Father! Don't worry, I'll be in Bayville from now on. I'll kill Kiran and give you grandchildren again." "Son," Alfred's lips trembled as he finally uttered the word. He nodded and said, "I trust you, I trust you." Alfred turned to Regulus and said from the bottom of his heart, "Thank you, Mr. Wolf." Regulus was calm as though he was a god that controlled the fate of others. He said, "Tomorrow we will kill Kiran, so you don't have to worry about that. Now that Warner is back, he can give you heirs so that the Ziegler family will rise again." "Yes, sir." Alfred and Warner responded with joy on their faces. Regulus looked at Henry and Theodore. "Your children are alive, too. Don't worry and just do your job. We will not do anything bad to you unless—" He had not even finished, but it sounded like a threat already. Henry and Theodore were lying, which was why they felt conflicted. They wanted to see their children, but they were afraid that Regulus might find out about their betrayal. "Let the banquet begin," Alfred shouted to express his gratitude toward Regulus. The Ziegler family started to get busy. Warner talked to his father for a while before leaving to prepare for the banquet as host. The Ziegler family had been revitalized now that they had a new pillar of strength. In the living room, Regulus glanced at the three of them. "You've been so comfortable the past 20 years that you couldn't handle the arrival of a young man like Kiran. What a disappointment." When the three heard that, they broke into a cold sweat. Theodore blinked quickly and said, "Mr. Wolf, Kiran is too strong. We're no match for him. That's why you had no choice but to betray Wolfgate and kill off all the witnesses, right?" Regulus looked at Theodore sinisterly. Theodore regretted what he said. He quickly groveled at Regulus's feet and said, "Mr. Wolf, my situation was different. Kiran already knew, so he came to my place to confirm." "Shut up!" Regulus shouted at him. Theodore dared not speak. "If not for the things you have done over the years, I would not have forgiven you." Regulus sounded murderous. Theodore nodded repeatedly. Even Henry and Alfred remained silent. Regulus looked at Theodore and Henry before saying, "Pick a woman from each of your families and send them here." "Huh?" Theodore and Henry exclaimed. There was panic in their eyes. They did not even know if their children were still alive, yet he wanted more hostages. Not to mention, he wanted women. "What? Didn't you see the damages the Ziegler family had to suffer?" Regulus asked coldly. Theodore and Henry's hearts sank. "Wolfgate rewards the good and punishes the bad." Regulus looked at Henry and said, "The Quinn family can send Yvonne over." Henry's body shook in fear. Yvonne was the link between him and Kiran. Regulus ignored Henry's face and said to Theodore, "Anyone from the Marsh family will do." Theodore thought hard about who he could send. "If they aren't here within half an hour, you will face the consequences." After Regulus said that, he closed his eyes to take a break. Theodore and Henry started to get nervous. Alfred was relieved. His grandson was dead anyway, so he enjoyed seeing the misfortunes of the two families. Theodore hesitated for some time before calling Tina, asking her to come to the Ziegler's house. Tina did not know what was going on, but she agreed anyway. Henry had no choice but to call Yvonne and ask her to come to the Ziegler's house too. However, Yvonne refused. It was on speakerphone, so everyone heard. Regulus's face turned sullen and he said to the phone, "If you don't come, be prepared to collect your grandfather's body." Chapter 254. "Who are you?" Yvonne asked coldly. "It's not your place to ask who I am, but if you don't come, your grandfather will die." Regulus's voice was merciless. "Evie, come quickly. Don't make Mr. Wolf angry." Henry was afraid. "Mr. Wolf?" Yvonne frowned. "Enough nonsense. Come collect your grandfather's body in half an hour." Regulus slammed his phone. Yvonne got anxious after they hung up the phone. She quickly stood up and looked at Frank. "Mr. Frank, we'll research the cosmetics tomorrow. I must go to the Ziegler's house right now to save my grandfather." She ran out before Frank could even reply. Frank was confused. He felt something was wrong and wanted to tell Kiran, but he did not have his phone number. He had no choice but to return to Xander Corporation and get Kiran's number from Onyx. Yvonne accelerated and drove to the Ziegler's house in 10 minutes. When she arrived, she saw Tina there too. They did not know each other, but they were both nervous. On entering the living room, Tina greeted Theodore. Yvonne walked over to Henry and said, "Grandpa, are you okay?" Henry was filled with shame. He shook his head and said, "I'm fine. Go greet Mr. Wolf." Yvonne followed her grandfather's gaze and looked at Regulus. Regulus opened his eyes and looked at their faces. He was surprised to see that both women were very beautiful. Although Yvonne looked ill, she was still beautiful in her down jacket. She was dressed for winter even though it was summer, making others feel uncomfortable just by looking at her. As for Tina, her feminine charm was overflowing. Every inch of her was alluring. Regulus looked at Alfred and said, "Since your grandson is dead, I have to care for you." Alfred was startled. He quickly asked, "What do you mean?" Henry and Theodore were curious too. Regulus raised his eyebrows and said, "Since Warner's wife can't return for the time being, there aren't any women around. Why don't you choose one woman from either the Quinn family or the Marsh family to marry into the Ziegler family? Then, you can help each other out and rebuild the relationship between the families." "Huh?" Theodore and Henry exclaimed and quickly looked at Tina and Yvonne. Tina thought about how she was responsible for Fabian's death. She could never marry into the Ziegler family, so she shook her head desperately and said, "No, I have a family. I have a husband and a child." Yvonne was calm. He must be out of his mind. He would be dead if he dared force her to marry into the Ziegler family. "Shut up!" Theodore shouted at Tina angrily. Since those two families had betrayed them, Alfred was pleased that his son would get to play around with their women and regain his strength. He wanted his son to have Yvonne, but he thought that she might die soon because of her illness, so he said to Regulus, "I picked Tina." Tina cried and shook her head. "No, Shut up!" Theodore interrupted her again. "Go get divorced immediately. Tonight, you will sleep with Warner," Regulus said bossily. Tina's soul left her body as she looked at Theodore pleadingly. However, Theodore obeyed his orders to save himself. Tina tried to escape, but when she got to the door, she was stopped by two men. With nowhere to run, she was in despair. Even if she was not the best wife, she could not accept being given to another man like this. Regulus looked at Henry. "I'll take your granddaughter, so just let her stay." Henry wanted to refuse, but the Marsh family agreed, so he dared not disobey. Plus, his granddaughter was already in the wolf's den. He looked at Yvonne apologetically. However, she was calm. There was nothing more tragic than a living person with a broken heart. She was not afraid of death, so what else would she be afraid of? Alfred happily called for the banquet to start. Warner was happy to hear that he was given a woman. Soon, the banquet began, and the Ziegler family celebrated as though it were a wedding. Meanwhile, Kiran was at Neptune's Cove karaoke, waiting to meet with Henry. When the banquet was over, Henry would bring Wolfgate to Kiran so that he could find out about their connection to the people who stole Neptune's Cove karaoke. Beep, beep. Just then, his phone rang. When Kiran saw that it was Onyx who called, he stood up and walked out before answering. "What's the matter?" "Mr. Kiran, it's Frank." Frank's voice sounded from the other end. "Frank? Why are you calling?" Kiran sounded curious. "I was researching cosmetics with Ms. Yvonne just now when she received a call. They asked her to go over to the Ziegler's house, or else her grandfather would be killed," Frank said anxiously. "Someone wants to kill Henry?" Kiran asked coldly. "The person's name is something like Wolf?" "Henry was very scared of him," Frank explained. Kiran remembered Henry saying that the leader of Wolfgate was coming to the Ziegler's banquet. It must be him. Why did they want Yvonne there? Kiran was puzzled, but he said calmly to Frank, "I got it. I'll take care of it." "Be careful, Mr. Kiran," Frank reminded. Kiran hung up and walked over to his car. When he got closer, he was surprised to see snow in the car. It took him a second to realize that it was the imposter. "You again?" Kiran held back his rage. "You've got quite the eye. How could you tell I'm not her at first glance?" Lillian smiled. "I don't have time for you right now, so get out of the car," Kiran said coldly. "No time for me. Then why did you come to Neptune's Cove karaoke?" Lillian asked, relaxed. "Will you get out of the car?" Kiran was worried about Yvonne, so he was starting to get impatient. "Why are you so mean to me?" Don't you see that I look exactly like your wife? Lillian teased. Nonsense. Kiran walked over to grab Lillian and lift her out. However, Lillian ducked and was already in the passenger seat. Would you like to take me for a ride? Kiran was shocked by Lillian's agility. How could she move so fast in such a small space? He calmed himself down and thought that since he wanted to find out their connection with Wolfgate, he might as well bring her too. He rolled his eyes and said, "Fine." Then he got in and started the car. Lillian sat in the passenger seat and asked casually, "Who do you think I look better as, Serena or Snow?" "I think you look better as yourself," Kiran said. Lillian's eyes lit up. "Kiran, are you flirting with me?" Chapter 255. Unfazed by her suggestion, Kiran started the car, pointedly ignoring her. There was a flicker of disappointment in her eyes, but she quickly resumed her usual demeanor. She stopped talking and stared ahead. In a flash, she had changed into a different person, a very haughty one. Kiran found this slightly puzzling. While driving, he glanced sideways at her profile. She looked exactly like Snow in her hyper-realistic mask, as if they had been cast in the same mold. "What are you looking at?" Lillian snapped. "I'm looking at my wife," Kiran taunted. His provocation sparked an inexplicable anger in her, as well as a hint of bitterness. "If you weren't wearing my wife's face, I wouldn't even bother to look at you." Kiran's next words were as cutting as a knife. Lillian sneered, her ego wounded. "All men do is lie. Think whatever you want. Anyway, I'm not interested in your request. As for the joyful Odyssey, I'll practice it if I want to and throw it away if I don't. As for my wife, I'll sleep with her as I please," Kiran said with exaggerated nonchalance. Lillian's eyes blazed with fury. Knitting her brow, she retorted coldly, "Kiran York, did you think I wanted to teach you the joyful Odyssey of my own accord?" "I don't care," Kiran continued to feign indifference. "Fine. Forget it." Lillian suddenly dropped the subject. Kiran was somewhat taken aback. He had deliberately provoked her so he could learn more about the joyful Odyssey. His master's warning to stop whatever he was doing if he heard the song, and his father's loss of the desire to live upon hearing it, were all mysteries he wished to unravel. He had no choice but to ask directly, "Is there something wrong with the harp you gave me?" "Like what?" she demanded frostily. "It played on its own today." The memory of the demonic sound angered him. "It played on its own?" Lillian's lip curled disparagingly. "Yes," Kiran affirmed. "That's because you betrayed your promise to me yesterday and tried to sleep with Snow." Lillian snickered. Kiran was stunned. "What do you mean? Can it monitor me?" "No idea." Lillian refused to answer his question. Kiran furrowed his brow. Lillian seethed with resentment. She could not understand why her master wanted her to teach Kiran the joyful Odyssey. However, she knew that if she continued to practice with him, their thoughts would start to resonate with each other. Then they would develop mutual feelings that transcended love and even achieve spiritual communication. The idea appalled her. All she wanted was to complete the task assigned by her master. However, she and Kiran had formed an emotional connection after only playing together once at Neptune's Cove karaoke the previous day. What if they took their practice to a higher level? She was disgruntled. Before Kiran could press for more information, they arrived at the Ziegler family's residence. Without another word, he parked the car and got out. He did not pay any more attention to Lillian, nor did he notice her still sitting there and frowning. He marched to the gates of the Ziegler family's mansion. Lillian slinked out of the car and vanished into the darkness. When Kiran approached the gates, he was instantly spotted by the Ziegler family's bodyguards. "Kiran York is here!" one of them shouted in fright. Alfred and the others were in the house, basking in their jubilation, when the shout came like an announcement of the Grim Reaper's arrival. They were instantly overcome with fear. Regulus shot a chagrined scowl in the direction of the entrance. "Useless pieces of trash!" At his implicit command, the gray-clothed men at the doors leaped into the yard and blocked Kiran's path, their eyes burning with murderous intent. Kiran eyed the elderly men before him, noting their white beards and hair. Instead of balking, he scoffed. "Do you find it fun to disguise yourselves as old men by wearing fake beards?" The men's faces hardened, for they did not know Kiran had exposed the pretense of the Marsh family's gray-clad defenders. "Die!" one of them roared. "Ooh, ooh, ooh." 3 gray shadows darted toward Kiran like unsheathed swords. At the same time, they brandished their fists, stirring violent gusts of wind. The Ziegler family's bodyguards were blown off their feet by the force of the small hurricane. Thump, thump, some of them toppled to the ground. Wham, wham! The sounds of punches landing on body rang out. Everyone turned their heads, only to be shocked by what they saw. Kiran did not dodge. Instead, he allowed his attackers' fists to hit his torso. However, he remained unscathed and composed even when struck by their powerful blows. Before the 3 men could recover from their bewilderment, he grabbed the beards of 2 of them in each of his hands, smirking. Nice disguise. As he spoke, he yanked on them hard. Tearing sounds split the air, followed by screams of agony. Kiran glanced down at the beards he had pulled off. There were blood stains and bits of flesh stuck to it. "Where did you get your fake beards?" "They stick pretty well," he asked earnestly, his expression curious. "It hurts." The 2 old men who had had their beards ripped off howled. Kiran's mouth curved up, and he pretended to be surprised. "Are these real beards?" "I don't believe it. Let me try again." With that, he dropped the beards in his hands and grabbed the beard of the 3rd man, who was still punching him. "Gah!" The man screeched and frantically withdrew his hands to cover his beard. However, it was too late. With a ripping sound, Kiran seized and tore it off fiercely. Because of the old man's attempt to stop him, he used more force and ended up tearing off a huge chunk of skin on the man's chin. "Aye!" The elderly guardian let out a deafening shriek, shielding his chin and doubling over in pain. Some of the Ziegler family's bodyguards peed their pants in terror. The remaining men in gray began to retreat. Although their fists remained clenched, they had lost their intimidating and menacing aura. To them, Kiran was the devil himself. A serene smile played on Kiran's lips. He knew that Wolfgate had sent out strong fighters this time, but in his eyes, they were rookies. He lifted his feet and sauntered to the mansion. Inside, Regulus and the others shot to their feet when they heard the screams, but none of them went out. Yvonne and Tina's faces lit up with hope. Bam! Kiran kicked open the doors to the mansion and strode in proudly. He immediately met the gaze of Regulus at the head of the table. The latter's eyes were like 2 burning coals, but Kiran ignored him. He raked his gaze across the guests and, noticing Yvonne, asked deliberately, "Why are you here?" "I didn't have a choice." Thinking that he was unaware of the truth, she explained anxiously, afraid he would misunderstand. "Then, get over here," he ordered. Yvonne scrambled to her feet and hurried to his side. "Save me, Mr. Kiran!" Recovering from her shock, Tina wailed pleadingly at him. Chapter 256. Kiran slid his gaze to Tina. "From what?" "They're forcing me to become Warner Ziegler's woman," she sobbed. "Who's Warner Ziegler?" Puzzled, Kiran shifted his attention to the only man he did not recognize. Although he had not been introduced to Regulus, he assumed he was the one at the head of the host's table. "I am Warner Ziegler, Alfred's son, and Fabian's father." Warner looked at Kiran haughtily. At his words, Kiran smirked at a bedridden Alfred. "And here I thought your family's bloodline had ended." He turned back to Tina. "What do you mean? Are they trying to make you bear Warner's child and continue the Ziegler family's bloodline?" She flushed and shook her head to express that she had no idea. "So what if that's true?" Furious at being ignored, Regulus snapped. "That won't do." Kiran shook his head. "And why is that?" Regulus demanded hotly. "Theodore has sided with me, which means Tina's now on my side, too." "How could she be with Warner and the Ziegler family?" Kiran replied casually. "Bullshit. I never sided with you." Theodore denied it indignantly. Regulus frowned at him skeptically. Theodore blanched and waved his hands anxiously. "Mr. Wolf, he's lying. I never sided with Kiran York." "Theodore, your family's the only one among the big 3 that hasn't really suffered any losses. Can Regulus believe you when you say you're not on my side?" Kiran taunted. Theodore's panic escalated. If you're here to sow discord and make us fight among ourselves, I'm afraid you will be disappointed." Regulus calmed down. Kiran smiled placidly. "The saddest thing in the world is that no one believes the truth." "What do you mean?" Regulus wanted to know. Kiran glanced at Tina. "Are you willing to become the York family's lapdog?" Tina flinched at the unpleasant question. However, remembering that he had spared her from being revealed in the video with Fabian, she dared not protest and immediately nodded. Yes, Kiran offered Regulus and Warner a shrug. So you want the York family's lapdog, eh? You... The veins on Warner's forehead bulged. Suddenly, he whirled around to Yvonne. I want her. Yvonne shrank back, her face tense. You want her? Snickering, Kiran pulled her into his arms. Is there a problem? Warner's anger mounted. I'd strongly advise you against coveting my woman. Kiran began advancing toward him. Being next to Regulus bolstered Warner's confidence, and he sneered at Kiran. I'd strongly advise you against acting insolently in front of Wolfgate's leader. Wolfgate's leader? A slight pause was all Kiran took before he launched himself into the air without warning. Like I give a damn. Bam! The next instant, his punch collided with Regulus's fist. Blarg! Regulus spurted out a mouthful of blood and staggered several steps back before regaining his balance. Because he had thrown his hand up at the last second to parry the blow, he had not been able to gather all his strength. As a result, he was wounded from the impact and vomited blood, which enraged him. How dare you sneak up on me? Kiran was unfazed. So what if I did? If you can't accept it, let's have a fair fight. Regulus was suddenly at a loss for words. He could not predict Kiran's next move at all. Finally alarmed, Warner tried to hide, but Kiran was already in front of him. However, Kiran did not commit any violence. Instead, he handed a fork to Warner. Warner was dumbfounded. What are you trying to do? Kiran lifted his hand and pointed at Alfred lying in bed. End him. Huh? Warner exclaimed, dropping the fork in disbelief. Kiran caught it swiftly and pressed it against his neck. It's your life or Alfred's. Make your choice. Warner was stupefied. Was he supposed to kill his father with his own hands? Instinctively, he glanced toward Regulus for help. Despite the latter's fury, his breathing was too unsteady for him to make any movement. Ah! Warner felt something pierce his neck. He looked down and saw blood dripping. The fork in Kiran's hand had penetrated the skin on his neck. Kiran said coolly, I don't want to waste time. Chills ran down Warner's spine. He had never seen such a cruel person. He quickly yanked the fork from his neck, relieved that he had been given a chance to live. He gripped the fork to ease his disquiet. He dropped his gaze to his father with a murderous glint in his eyes. Alfred began to panic. Although he was disabled, he still wanted to survive. Warner, I'm your father. Warner's stomach churned with mixed emotions. They had finally reunited after being apart for so many years. Still, he gritted his teeth and said, Goodbye, Schlook! The fork plunged into Alfred's neck, piercing the main artery. Blood sprayed everywhere, splattering all over Warner's face. Warner had stabbed his birth father to death with a fork. Never in Alfred's wildest imagination had he thought his son would kill him. He had expected his son to take over the family and help him exact revenge. In the end, his son was the one to send him to his death. If he was ruthless, his son was even more cold-blooded. He had waited for so many years, only to be killed by the very person he had been waiting for. His eyes widened with regret as he breathed his last. Warner wiped the blood from his face and turned to Kiran, his gaze pleading with him to let him go. Hiss! Theodore and the others in the room inhaled sharply, their eyes full of fear. Regulus was beside himself with rage. Kiran had humiliated him to the face. Kiran York, you've gone too far. Kiran felt somewhat conflicted. He had only been testing Warner. He knew that Warner and many others had been held hostage by Wolfgate for many years. By stabbing Alfred, Warner showed that he no longer cared for his father and showed his viciousness. All this reminded Kiran of Snow's parents, and his heart grew heavy. He hoped that they would not be this unfeeling, too. Soon, he composed himself and smiled at Theodore and Henry. I wonder if it'll be the same when your children come back. His suggestion jolted them to their senses like the chime of a bell, and they could not help quaking as if struck by lightning. They wheeled around to stare at a blood-smeared Warner, their hearts filling with despair over the death of their ally. Warner continued to look at Kiran beseechingly, unbothered by their gazes. The past years of living without purpose had shaped him into a cold and callous person. Now all he wanted was to survive. For that reason, he had steeled his heart to kill his own father. Kiran York, are you trying to turn us against each other? Regulus finally caught his breath and snarled at Kiran. Chapter 257. Turn you against each other? Kiran chuckled. Is that even necessary? Didn't you see me order Warner to kill his father with his own hands? I can, and I will. Do whatever I want. You're a pompous bastard. Regulus was livid. I know. Didn't you see that just now? Kiran smirked at Henry and Theodore. They are called Wolfgate, so they raised your children to become wolves too. Your children are wolf cubs. Henry and Theodore's hearts began to waver. Despite the harshness of Kiran's words, the sight of Alfred's cold corpse and Warner's callous face were proof that he was right. Damn you! Whoosh! An incensed Regulus roared and rushed forward, aiming a brutal punch at Kiran's head. Bam! Kiran warded him off with a casual fling of his arm. However, the powerful impact sent him staggering several steps back before finally regaining his balance. A look of shock crossed his face, and he stared at Regulus in disbelief. You're that strong? Regulus was just as surprised that he had forced Kiran back with a single punch. Arrogance boosted, he curled his lip. Damn right I am! You're nothing but a weakling before me. Kiran, are you okay? Yvonne ran over to help Kiran up, her face full of concern. Everyone thought Kiran had backed away because he had been hit hard, but they failed to notice the glint of contempt in his eyes. He had retreated on purpose to inflate Regulus's ego. While killing Wolfgate's members in a decisive battle the next day was important, finding Snow's parents was his priority. If he killed them now, it would make his search difficult. Therefore, he chose to feign weakness to deceive his enemy. Pretending to endure the pain, he shook his head at Yvonne to show he was fine before turning to Regulus. I got hit outside 3 times by your men in gray. That's why my breathing's a little messed up. Otherwise, you wouldn't have touched a hair on me. Regulus was beside himself with glee to hear that Kiran had been hit by his men. Kiran was not as powerful as he had imagined. He could not even beat his men. Humph. How I wish I could send you to hell right now. Don't get too cocky, Regulus. It won't be that simple to kill me, Kiran responded icily, as if afraid that he would be attacked right there and then. Regulus was practically bursting with hubris. Don't worry, I won't kill you here. I'll kill you tomorrow among the ruins of your family's mansion on Dragon's Mount, and let those ruins become the backdrop for you and your family's demise. Ha ha. Kiran's eyes flashed coldly, but he suppressed his anger. It's too soon to say who will win tomorrow. Don't forget to bring Snow's parents. Regulus smiled cruelly. Don't worry, I can't possibly pass up the opportunity to let them watch their dear son-in-law die. I'll see you tomorrow, Regulus. Kiran draped his arm across Yvonne's shoulders for support. Regulus did not stop him from leaving. In his eyes, killing Kiran was a piece of cake. Remember to get someone to collect your dead body tomorrow, Kiran. The same goes for you, Regulus. Kiran wobbled out of the living room with his arm around Yvonne. Regulus did not order any of his members to take action. On the contrary, he merely watched them leave with self-assured disdain. What was the point of winning or losing if it was all just empty promises? Upon exiting the mansion, Kiran immediately loosened his hold on Yvonne and walked toward his car. However, to make his act more convincing, he pretended to wobble and stumble. Yvonne hurried over to support him. Let's take my car. Without waiting for his consent, she dragged him into her car and drove off. They left Kiran's car behind. Chapter 258. Catching everything through the security cameras, Regulus and the others were convinced that Kiran was seriously injured, which further fueled their scorn for him. Eliminating Kiran was child's play in Regulus's eyes. He glanced at Henry and Theodore. Kiran will die tomorrow, and the York family will be completely destroyed. Your future will depend on your performance. Both men nodded repeatedly, relieved that they had been spared. Theodore even pushed Tina in Warner's direction. Tina's heart was still thundering in her chest after she witnessed Warner murder Alfred with her own eyes. She was starting to regret her past actions. If she had accepted Kiran's offer of goodwill, she would not be where she is today. However, it was too late. Warner was not particularly ashamed of killing his father. After making arrangements to have the body sent to the morgue, he washed up and ordered dinner to be prepared again. Regulus and the others ate and drank to their heart's content as they anticipated Kiran's demise the next day. As for Alfred's death, it was lighter than a feather. It was as if he had never existed. Henry and Theodore were both nervous and despondent. When they thought of their children, they even felt a sense of despair. Wolf cubs. The two words lingered in their minds. While the banquet was in full swing, a woman slipped out of the mansion carrying another woman on her back and drove away in Kiran's car. It was none other than Lillian. With her was an unconscious, beautiful, middle-aged woman. Upon closer inspection, her features resembled Snow's in some measure. Meanwhile, in Yvonne's car, Kiran resumed his usual demeanor. Nevertheless, Yvonne still cast furtive looks of worry at him from time to time. "You can just stare at me if you want. No need to peek," Kiran chuckled. Yvonne's hands shook in embarrassment, nearly sending the car swerving into the curb. Blushing, she asked tentatively, "Are you okay? Why wouldn't I be?" Kiran was perfectly calm. "Didn't you say you were injured just now?" Yvonne was puzzled. Instead of explaining, Kiran merely smiled. "What would you do if something happened to me?" If something happened to you, I would go with you." Yvonne could feel her cheeks burning, but she fixed him with a determined gaze. Kiran was stunned for a moment before asking jokingly, "What if I got killed?" "Then I'd die with you too." Yvonne bit her lip, her jaw set resolutely. You would die with me," Kiran exclaimed, then continued, "You aren't in love with me, are you?" Yvonne's pallid complexion turned beet red. Was this man an idiot? Did he really need her to spell it out for him? Can't a girl have some dignity? She was a heartbeat away from confessing her love when she remembered he had a wife. Dejected, she said, "If you die, no one will be able to cure me, which means I'll die sooner or later. In that case, I might as well die with you." "Woo!" Kiran heaved a long sigh of relief and patted his chest. "You scared me for a moment." His actions confused Yvonne, and she could not help but ask curiously, "What were you scared of?" "I was scared you were in love with me." Kiran looked troubled. Yvonne felt like grabbing his collar and screaming in his face. Was she that undesirable? She was far from ugly, and she was willing to live and die together with him. "I'm a married man." Kiran gazed out the window, seemingly talking to himself, but it also sounded like a reminder to Yvonne. There was a flicker of sadness and despair in her countenance. She concentrated on driving and stopped talking altogether. Kiran returned to the Xander family's villa. The villa was brightly illuminated, indicating that Harold and the others were waiting for him. Chapter 259. "Kiran's back!" As soon as he entered the villa, he was greeted with Rain's excited cry. Serena raised an eyebrow, her eyes crinkling merrily, her feminine charm on full display. Snow's eyes lit up with joy, too. However, it was soon replaced with anger as a frown creased her forehead. She could smell women's perfume on him. He had been fooling around. Kiran turned to Harold and Margaret first. "Why are you still awake?" "You'll be fighting Wolfgate tomorrow, Kiran. We were worried for you," Margaret said in concern, her voice breaking slightly. "I just came back from the Ziegler family's residence. I met Wolfgate's members there," Kiran said breezily. "What?" the others exclaimed in unison, and regarded him with trepidation in their eyes. He smiled. "They're just a bunch of weaklings, don't worry. You can never be too careful," Harold warned him gravely. "Wolfgate brought back Alfred's son Warner, and I forced him to kill his father with his own hands." To reassure them, Kiran told them the truth. "Huh." Margaret and Rain covered their mouths, their eyes wide with horror. The others sat up straight in shock as well. "Regulus was right beside me when it happened, but he didn't stop me," Kiran stressed. Are you okay?" All feelings of indignation gone, Snow approached him and examined him from head to toe with a worried look on her face, afraid that some part of him was missing. Kiran wished he could say he was not okay. He had just rejected Yvonne's confession. However, he could never reveal that, or this place would start reeking of jealousy. "Ha ha ha," Harold laughed in relief. "I'm glad to hear that. That's great." He turned to Margaret. "Let's go to bed. Kiran can handle the rest. As long as we take good care of ourselves and don't cause him trouble, we'll be doing him a huge favor." Margaret nodded in agreement. Yes, let's go to bed." The two seniors shuffled upstairs. Kiran glanced at Serena and Rain. "You two should head to bed early too. Don't worry about this. Just get ready to throw a celebration party for me tomorrow night." Rain sneaked a peek at Snow, who was clinging to Kiran's arm. Crestfallen, she inclined her head silently and returned to her room. Serena gave Kiran and Snow a shrug. Try to tone it down tonight, will you? You've got a difficult battle tomorrow after all. Hee hee. What the hell are you talking about? Snow whined in mortification. 500 rounds shouldn't be a problem. Kiran winked at her playfully. Do you need Viagra? Serena chuckled. Get lost! Maddened by Kiran and Serena's joint craziness, Snow flung his arm off and dashed back to her room. Mr. Kiran, you have women's perfume all over you. I'm guessing there were at least 2 of them, right? Giggling, Serena escaped into her room as well. Kiran rubbed his nose in frustration. This woman was truly an expert at fanning the flames of trouble. He went to his room and showered before heading to Snow's. She seemed to have anticipated his visit. She was lying in bed, idly scrolling through her phone. Still awake? Kiran sat on the edge and moved to crawl in next to her. Go away. Go occupy yourself with another woman. Snow shoved him away with feigned annoyance, refusing to let him into her bed. Aren't you scared I'll go to another woman's bed? He chuckled. I don't care whose bed you sleep in, Snow retorted haughtily. But I've fallen in love with your bed. What should I do? Kiran said shamelessly. Not a chance. Snow rejected him coldly. What if I've fallen in love with you? Kiran continued, grinning. For a moment, Snow was lost for words, too startled by his confession. Honey, I need to talk to you about something. Kiran's tone turned serious. What? Snow snapped to attention. Since you're okay with me calling you honey, that means you're okay with me sharing a bed with you. Before she knew it, Kiran was lying next to her. You. Snow slapped him on his arm. You shameless pig. He reached out and enveloped her in his embrace. Her heart warmed and she did not resist. Kiran gave her a peck on her forehead. She immediately squirmed. Don't try anything funny. You need to rest. Theft! Kiran burst out laughing. Snow blushed and glared at him. But I really need to talk to you about something. Kiran stopped teasing her and let his solemn expression fall back into place. What is it? Snow asked. Her cheeks flushed. He drew her closer. Are you ready for your parents' return? Snow instantly stiffened and stared at him, a myriad of expressions flashing across her face. Why do you ask? Kiran was quiet for a while. Eventually, he recounted how he had forced Warner to kill Alfred, highlighting Warner's selfishness and indifference. Snow felt her body go cold, and she instinctively tightened her hold on him. Will my parents turn out that way too? I don't know, but I think you should be prepared for all possibilities, he replied honestly. Snow's eyes misted over. I get what you mean. Kiran placed a gentle kiss on each of her eyelids. Her heart swelled with affection, and she hugged him more tightly. His eyes suddenly glittered with amusement. Honey, who would you pick if you had to choose between your parents and me? How am I supposed to choose? Snow shot him a miffed look. What if you have to? Kiran insisted. A conflicted expression fell over her face. After some silence, she said, When Grandpa was ill, he gave me an instruction. What was it about? Kiran wanted to know. If I ever have to choose between my parents and the York family, I'll have to choose the latter, he said. Snow began to sniffle. A wave of emotion surged in Kiran's heart, and he cupped her face in his hands. What did he say? He said I'll have to pretend my parents are dead. Ooh-wah. She threw her arms around him and burst into tears. Although she did not tell him who was important to her, he already knew the answer and embraced her firmly. Don't cry. It was just a hypothetical question. Even if your parents have hearts of stones, I'll do everything I can to melt them. Snow was deeply moved, but she put on a proud front. I don't believe you. You say I annoy you, but you let me sleep in your bed and hold you and... Moomph! He was hushed by a scowling Snow's porcelain-white fingers on his lips. Keep blabbering and I'll bite you. Kiran nodded and she withdrew her hand. Suddenly he tapped himself on the head in realization. I finally understand why you like biting me. Snow was baffled. Why? Because I'm a horny dog, Kiran guffawed. What do you mean? She was even more puzzled. You become just like the person you married. Ha-ha! Kiran roared with laughter. Screw you! Snow's dainty fists landed on him like raindrops. Chapter 260. The next morning, Kiran gazed at Snow sleeping in his arms. He leaned over and kissed her on the forehead, then hopped out of bed and returned to his room to change. After he closed the door behind him, Snow opened her eyes with a blissful smile, which soon transformed into determination. Clenching her fists, she vowed to herself, Kiran, if you live, I live. If you die, I die. She did not get up. She did not want her emotions to affect Kiran. Like her, the others in the villa were already awake, but did not get out of bed. This was Harold's instruction, and the reason was simple. If they already made a huge fuss over Kiran's initial confrontation with the enemy, how would they be prepared for the future? All of them understood that this was to avoid pressuring Kiran, so they remained in bed. In his room, Kiran was pleased to find that Snow had prepared a white suit for him in advance. White was the color of sacrifice. It was the best color to symbolize the start of the York family's new era of glory. He raised his head and looked out the window, murmuring to himself, "It's been 20 years. From today on, I will use the Imperial Dragon's blood to honor all of you. May your grieving souls rest in peace as soon as possible. As long as I'm here, the York family will never die." His body was charged with fighting spirit and ferocity. It was his way of comforting the departed souls of the York family. After getting dressed, he walked out of the residential area to take a taxi to Dragon's Mount. Just then, he caught sight of his Ferrari parked by the road. A woman dressed in white sportswear was seated inside. It was none other than Lillian. Kiran strode up to her. "You left the Ziegler family's mansion in my car yesterday?" "Duh." While Lillian was not wearing a disguise, most of her face was concealed beneath her large sunglasses. "You finally decided to show your real face today?" Kiran eyed her stunning profile. "You'll never get to see my real face," she answered coldly. "I'm not interested. You'll never be as beautiful as my wife anyway," Kiran retorted coolly. Lillian furrowed her brow, her anger threatening to boil over. "Are you from the Imperial Dragon?" Kiran suddenly asked. "You scared?" Lillian scoffed. "Scared? Ha!" Kiran snickered. "Why should I be scared of who you are when I've never even bothered to ask your name?" "Spoken like a true man." With that, Lillian stepped on the accelerator, and the car sped toward Dragon's Mount. An unspoken understanding to remain silent hung between them. They were like strangers and acquaintances at the same time. However, neither harbored any hostility to the other. Kiran could not bring himself to be hostile to her, because there was no hatred in the joyful odyssey. As for Lillian, she did not have any intention of killing Kiran at the moment, so she was naturally not averse to him. It was Kiran's second time visiting Dragon's Mount. This time, it was early in the morning. The sun shone on the mountain from the eastern sky, shrouding it in rays of light and giving it a mysterious beauty. "The mountains will forever stand tall, and the rivers will flow without end." Out of nowhere, Lillian exclaimed sentimentally. "Meaning?" Kiran wanted to know. "Life is short. Once we die, all our joy and sorrow fade away into dust. In contrast, no matter how the seasons change, these mountain peaks will never change. That is real immortality." Kiran was quiet for a brief moment. "You're wrong." "Wrong?" Lillian repeated in confusion. "The mountains and rivers may change, but some people will live on even in death." Kiran's expression was solemn. "Who are you talking about? Your family?" Lillian questioned. "It's not just my family. It applies to all families." For a while, Kiran gazed wordlessly at the scenery outside the window. Only family culture and spirit can last forever.